Welcome to Cycling Fashion Week, the only podcast in the world that is purely concerned with cycling aesthetics, style, and fashion. I am your host, Alex, joined by my co-hosts, Warren and Tony. And Cycling Fashion Week is brought to you by leclub.cc, hosts of the world's most exciting and premium cycling brands. leclub.cc is your go-to destination for the season's premium cycling apparel. Shop brands like MAP, Universal Colors, Fingers Crossed, Quack, Alba Optics, Sweet Protection. They've got worldwide shipping. They've got the best coffee in the business as well. Demand more from your cycling experience. Go to leclub.cc and you will be very happy with what you're ordering. More brands and categories are going to be arriving soon. And as I mentioned on previous shows, they've got a brand new online experience right now. So the new website for Le Club looks pretty good right now. Okay, Warren, Tony, how is it going this week?
I just want to say Le Club because they just carry the best stuff. And I mean, I know we're sponsored by them, and it sounds like I'm just trying to big them up, which
You
is
are.
sort of true.
Yeah,
But also, come on, everything they've got, the Alba Optics, by far the nicest sunglasses you could be, just purely from aesthetic point. I don't know anything about lenses. Just all the stuff, the Sweet Protection, the Quack shoes are beautiful, just everything.
And we are going to try to get to Le Club physically this summer to record an episode from there, right, Tony?
We'll do a live episode from there. You're not allowed to come and watch because Alex hates the community, and that would feel very community oriented. So I would say don't come by while we're there, but come by at other times to get a latte.
To get a coffee and buy some premium products.
Yeah, exactly.
Speaking of buying premium products, I want to talk about something that happened recently. So Warren and I are part of this. So I live in Montreal, as our listeners know, but I spend a bit of time in Toronto for my job. And Warren and I are part of this Toronto resale bike parts and bicycles group. And it's basically people just putting their bikes up for sale, or if people are looking for a bike, they'll be posting their specifications there and people will sell something. Actually, Warren, why don't you talk about it? Because there's someone selling something for a ridiculous price that really epitomized the state of the current market.
There's a few, but one in particular. I forget what the group is called exactly. It's Toronto Buy and Sell Road CX Bikes. I'm sure many cities or large towns have groups of some sort, though in this group, people from the suburbs of Toronto and very far, not the suburbs, like hours and hours drive, post in this group because they think they're going to find a buyer. Anyway, somebody recently posted a specialized LA expert from, I think, 2007.
2006.
2006,
yes,
with mismatched shifters and a bent water bottle cage. And the price they listed at was $2,300, which is the current price of a new LA, I believe.
Well, I think a 105 disc. Now I can't remember if it's disc brake, but I think it's disc brake equipped. New specialized LA Elite. So not the Sprint, not the sort of top end one, but kind of in the same ballpark as this guy posted. 15 years later is $2,300 at a shop near me. Exact same as retail for a 15-year-old bike that's not even that great a shape.
But what really did it for me too is that specific member of the group, he was sort of writing down the specs of his bike, and he tried to take somewhat artsy photos of the bike too, but they were really horrible. But basically, he's pretty shameless about it. He lists it at a crazy price, and at the end, the icing on the cake, he said, and the bike just had a full tune-up from Rick's Bike Shop in Kingston, Ontario, as if this justified the $2,300 price on that bike. It's absolutely insane.
At the top of his thing, he said serious inquiries only, and I thought you can't be serious. What? We should all be joking on it. And it's what's wild about it is a couple weeks ago, I'm trying to help a friend find a sort of gravel bike, and he sent me a link to a 2020 Topstone, Cannondale Topstone, that someone, again, they always say it was only ridden for 3 rides. Every bike out there's only been ridden for 3 rides somehow. and it was same as retail. It was same as retail, and obviously now it's a couple years older. I think bikes similar to cars, once they get off the lot, you got to drop the price by a lot. So I already thought that that was a little outrageous because I was like, well, why are they charging the same as retail? But this was still only a 2-year-old bike. And now this guy comes across with a 15-year-old bike and is selling it for retail.
I know we're harping on this one guy, but like it's not just him. Like the bike market has been insane. I mean, this is more of a question for our listeners, and maybe they can like DM us or email us and let us know if it's the same in like every major city where on the cycling market. But it's for the past 2 years, it's been the case with almost every bike. And like at least, some bikes that are outrageously priced are nice bikes. Like this was a piece of shit. In all fairness, people were ripping them in the comments being like, this price is crazy, blah blah blah. But I feel like I can go on that group any day of the week and find a bike that's been posted at an outrageously high overvalued price, and people will often call the seller on the price, and most of the time the seller's like, this is the market. Sure, but don't be an asshole. Like, if cyclists out there really want to be all about community and get more people in the sport, sell your used bikes at a reasonable
Well,
price.
and
Like,
when they say this is the market, I mean, some of these pieces of crap are sitting unsold
yeah,
for a long time. So clearly the market says you should be selling it lower.
But even if you're right that it's the market, like I hate the idea, and I mean this extends beyond anybody, everything's sort of resale. I hate the idea that like people don't understand, like to me, when you buy something and use it, especially if you use it a lot, like you've got your value. Like you don't need the financial compensation back because the value in the bike, as an example, is what you've done with it. So if you've got a bike and it's a few years old and you got a lot out of it, if you paid $1,500 or $2,000, well, sure, it's great to get a little cash in the pocket, but you've used up part of that $2,000 value. And so the fact that everyone feels they need to be, some sort of entrepreneur and try and squeeze every dollar out, it's just the whole culture of it bothers me. And also, yeah, like I like, we want people to get into cycling, and it's a really tough sport to get into because bikes are expensive, kit is expensive. And when you see a bike that, a friend's trying to get in and you want to sort of stuff, and someone's selling a piece of crap bike for the price of a brand new one you could walk into the store and get, it makes it hard because you can't, you say to someone, oh yeah, let's look online for a used one to get you into cycling. You're hoping to spend a few $100 so someone can test it out. You can't even find that. It's because some assholes just charging this exorbitant amount, and then they're saying serious inquiries only. So if that bike the guy posted as our example is probably worth, I would pay $300 for it. And so if I
yeah.
send him $300, he'd probably tell me to fuck off. But that's what that bike is worth.
Definitely makes me feel good having gotten the CAD 5 Saeco for 600, and I think I paid 650, 675 for it, which was probably a fair price for that one. But I do think it's a little bit worse in Toronto than in other cities, given that I look at prices in Montreal and in Toronto. Guys, huge episode today. This week on Cycling Fashion Week, we have no less than a multiple time Grand Tour stage winner. David Millar is going to be joining us. Just for a little reminder for our listeners, I'm sure you know who David Millar is, but he won 4 stages of the Tour de France, 1 stage of Giro, 5 stages of the Vuelta. He is a legend of professional bike racing, but also cycling style. He's always been a very elegant rider. So we're very fortunate to have him on the podcast this week. Guys, does that mean we've made it in the podcasting world?
It's a huge get. He's a good friend of the show. Our other good friend, Cycling Tips, who I think probably right now are sort of at the top of the podcast in the few different iterations of their podcast. They should watch out. Friendly competition because we're good friends with them, but they should watch out because we're definitely disruptors and we're definitely moving towards the top.
Tony, do you think it's a situation like our good friends at Cycling Tips sitting on top of the podcasting world? Do you think it's kind of like Panorama Studios? They're the incumbent. They're on top currently, but we're that little brand that's like rising and getting to the top pretty fast.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think one of the things, and I'm sure this will change when we become like the GCN of podcasts, is that we have no, we have a sort of a small sponsor who's great, and they're kind of giving us, free reigns, and we can just say all the stupid shit we want. We don't care about facts. Most of it's just a random opinion that we have that can be probably different the next week. Once we're sort of sold out and we're the the little engine that could, and we're at the top, and everything is sponsored. Every segment is sponsored. The shirts we're wearing while we're recording is sponsored. Then we'll have to dial it back. But I'm okay with that because that's free stuff and that's why we're here.
Okay, next up, our next segment, we are very excited to welcome a very special guest. And I always say that our guests are special, but this one is particularly special because it's not every day that here on Cycling Fashion Week we get to welcome a 4-time Tour de France stage winner, a 5-time Vuelta stage winner, and a 1-time Giro stage winner. So, as you can tell, he's a pretty legendary former professional cyclist, but he's also the founder of Chapter 3, cycling apparel brand Chapter 3. David Millar joins us from his home in Girona. David, thank you very much for joining us and welcome to Cycling Fashion Week.
No, thank you guys. Thanks, Alex, Warren, Tony. It's kind of stumbled across you last week, literally going to a bike shop in Girona. And somebody said, and like, and this, I feel really bad about this because they said, oh, I was just listening to this podcast and they called you out. And I was the narcissist in me was like, "Fuck, I gotta go and listen to that." And I haven't stopped listening to it since. I've gone through your whole archive because it's honestly, it's been missing from my life for so long how you see cycling. But we'll get into that. Thank you for doing what you're doing because I've just been spreading the word. My wife listens to it in the car. It's in the Chapter 3 studio. It's just everywhere I go. I'm just kind of because I'm just laughing the whole time.
So thanks to you, it looks like we've taken over Girona. Well,
Oh yeah.
I guess you're sort of the perfect guest for Cycling Fashion Week because as you can tell listening to our archive, we're huge pro cycling fans on top of being very amateur riders ourselves. But one reason why I was particularly keen to get you on the podcast was because when I started following pro cycling in the early 2000s, my father sort of introduced me to the Tour de France. You were a rising rider, I would say, at that time. And I sort of followed your career throughout the 2000s and the 2010s. And it was always understood that you were a very elegant writer, that you were stylish. The commentators on French language television sometimes would call you le dandy, as you were known to have an elegant style. Your position on the bike was stylish. The clothes that you were wearing were stylish. So, in that respect, you're kind of the perfect Cycling Fashion Week guest. Where, again, as I always say, we look at cycling from a purely superficial and aesthetic point of view. So in this respect, we're very happy to have you on, so we can discuss kind of your perspective on cycling aesthetics as well, and we'll also talk about your brand, Chapter 3. Maybe I'll start with a very simple question. How did you get started on a bike, and was your interest in cycling just purely athletic at first, or was there more of a cultural, more of an aesthetic background to your first foray into cycling?
It was incredibly cultural. It was in the very north of Scotland where I started, and just as it is, I think we're all as they say, Gen Z. So it's kind of 80s, 90s. So I grew up in the 80s where BMX was everywhere. BMX skating was coming up. BMX was like this alternative kind of cool form of cycling, and it was incredibly inclusive and accessible, but actually was cool and alternative. And I was just a kid in Scotland. I kind of got into it. Then my family, we moved down to England near London, just west of London. And there were BMX tracks in places you can go and race. And so every weekend during the summer, my dad would take me because I wanted him to take me to this BMX track in High Wycombe, just go racing, a full face helmet, the kind of all the gear, kind of. I didn't have. Remember this? I was riding a Rally Super Tough Burner, which was my kind of bike. And all the kids I was racing against had full blown race bikes because their dads were more into it than them. My dad was a wing commander in the Royal Air Force who was kind of entertaining as a kid. And I guess that for me, and that's something we can come back to. For me, cycling was just always an alternative sport, and BMX was alternative. And then when mountain biking kicked in the late 80s, my first mountain bike was a Marin Bear Valley that I bought in 1990. It was an 89, and that's then what got me into mountain biking with the same vibe of BMX. And then I went to Hong Kong and again just doing it on my own and did a mountain bike race. And there were some expats there who were roadies from the UK who saw me on a mountain bike. I was 14, 15 years old. And they were like, you should get on a road bike. And I was like, what? The road bike had never even crossed my mind because I'd been BMXing, skating, mountain biking. But then I'd go mountain biking with them at weekends, and they would then leave me with magazines, come and drop magazines off at the shop I'd go to in Mongkok, Flying Ball, and they do videos, VHS videos of bike races, and I'd pick them up and I'd watch them, and I'd then start spending my own money, my pocket money, to go and buy Velo News from this crazy magazine shop, and they'd be wrapped in cellophane, kind of sealed up in this crazy Chinese shop, and I'd take them home, and I fell in love with road cycling because it seemed so insanely romantic and impossible that a sport like that could exist, and nobody knew about it. And so I sold my mountain bike, bought a road bike, and thought, I want to do the Tour de France. I want to do that. And so that was how I got into it. It was just no family, no older brothers, no friends. It was just, I want to go and do that crazy sport. So that's how I got into it.
We've mentioned before, Alex isn't one of them, the people, but that like Warren and I could draw a direct line from our starting of skateboarding, especially as sort of early teens, to us being road cyclists, and it sounds sort of very similar kind of thing. We got into it. It was super alternative. It was really cool. You know, this was kind of birth of the internet, pre-internet. So you were at the shops getting Thrasher magazine or Transroll or something, and then I mean, for me, it was kind of the same thing. Mostly for skateboarding, it just physically became too hard, and I kind of got into fixies and then road cycling. But that same kind of idea that it was like, it was cool, but nobody else knew how cool it was.
Yeah, and you know what? That's an interesting point, Tony, because shops were the hub. It was only shops. I'd hang out at Flying Ball Bicycle in Hong Kong. There was, I think it was called Cycle Works in High Wycombe, or Dave Russell was this tiny little shop in Twyford, which was like 10 miles away from. Because I lived in Hong Kong. My parents were divorced, and I, in my school holidays, go to the UK, and I knew nobody there because my mum had moved since I'd left. She knew I was getting into cycling, so she joined me up into a cycling club and would drive me around and just keep me entertained, going to these events and different things. But I'd then hunt down, probably through the yellow pages or something, so there's no internet, like the local bike shops, and go and check them out. And there was this one called Dave Russell Cycles, and he was an old frame builder, kind of, and it was this huge dude, and it was this tiny little bolt hole shop in this village just outside the train station. Remember that? And I just used to ride out there, do my kind of rides, and spend, Christ, probably hours there talking to him. And he showed me albums of him racing in the 1950s with Reg Harris and different things. And he built my first custom bike. So that would be 1994. He built me a bike when I was just starting to get good. I was in the national team. And that bike still exists. I use it for a Noroika. So that was my kind of, for me, it was alternative, and I didn't like team sports, and I fucking hated school, and cycling was my escape.
See, your story resonates a lot, I think, with us
Yeah.
as North Americans, because if you're a kid in North America and you choose cycling as your sport, it's definitely alternative, because I guess the most kind of popular kids or the very athletic kids will go into baseball or football
Yeah.
or hockey or
Yeah.
these kinds of more North American sports. So I feel like in North America, there is that alternative side to road cycling. Whereas in Europe, it's a continental Europe, at least it's a much more mainstream sport. So a kid who's a good athlete might get steered into it. Another thing you said, I think is really interesting too, which Tony Warren and I can definitely associate with. I think we were part of the last pre-internet generation. I guess we existed both in the pre-internet days and in the post-internet days. So we can remember what it's like to go into a bookstore and check out the magazines that are about cycling. Whereas kids nowadays, I find, will probably just go on TikTok or Instagram and hear about cycling from influencers, which is a totally different perspective than what we had back in the day.
I was going to say to David, talking about going in the shops, is anything like me in the skateboard shops, and Warren, it would be hours in the skateboard shop not buying anything.
Yeah, that was
Didn't
it.
have any money, and they didn't seem to care. Like the ones around Toronto, and
No.
it was sort of building up around the kind of late 90s, early 2000s, but it was still a pretty niche sport.
It's the
And you go
community,
in,
Tony.
yeah, the community, and you go in, and they'd have couches and skate videos on repeat, and you could sit there. You'd be a 14-year-old with barely $1 in your pocket, and then you could be there for 3 hours, and nobody seemed to care.
But did you do the thing that I did? I used to hang out in Flying Ball so much and almost became a pseudo salesman that you kind of hope that you'd get something.
Yes,
That was my vibe. It was
yeah.
like somebody's gonna like kind of shout you something, either the shop owner or kind of one of the customers will see you're just this grommet, and just kind of support you. I was very much like that at Flying Bull. I just used to hang out there and got to the point where I was just helping them sell stuff and then would get freebies. And I was like, bonus.
We're, 20 years, more than 20 years on from the skateboarding stories. We started a podcast and really we just want free stuff.
Yeah,
So
that's it.
we haven't changed at all. We started this thing and every time someone says, "Hey, let me send you something," we're like, "Oh, we made it. We did it."
Never stops. It never
So David,
stops.
so obviously, so you start cycling, you're visibly pretty talented at it. You've got a natural sort of disposition for I guess cardiovascular activity, and then so you go pro in Europe. You go pro in France, I think in northern France, in Picardy. Tell us about your early experiences of going pro in Europe, and tell us about the culture of cycling, and tell us about how the aesthetic side of things. How were the kids? How did you feel about the whole experience overall?
For me, it's kind of paradoxical in the sense that I was European, but I didn't feel like I was from UK at that point. I was a full Hong Kong kid, and when I was 18, I'd kind of spent my formative years there, and it was a very different fashion, very different vibe. It was a very different existence. Like this was 1990 to 1995, pre-handover. It's probably one of the most insane experiences anybody could have ever lived to live in Hong Kong in the early 90s. And or I was supposed to be going to art college, and because I basically, and this sounds really bad, flunked everything else, knowing that I could get into art college. But then I in my school holidays, I go and race bikes, and I really didn't like the UK. I didn't want to live there. I didn't want to go back. I'd left there because I didn't like it. And I didn't really know much about Europe. I'd never seen the Alps, never seen the Pyrenees. And that was one of the romantic things about watching these VHS videos of the Tour de France. It was seeing something that I'd never seen before. We weren't a wealthy family. We went on skiing holidays and did these different things. So those were all kind of, oh, Europe, that seems pretty cool. So when it came to that crunch point, as you say, I was predisposed genetically to be very good at it, and I loved it. So just raced through the ranks, and I thought I could be a pro, like really young. So I told my mum, asked my mum, told my mum, kind of asked, told, I'd like to defer my place at art college to spend a year to turn pro. This is me when I was 18. Because I figured if I couldn't turn pro in a year, then I wouldn't be good enough. But at the same time, everyone in the UK was like, you're too young to go, because UK had this really fixed mentality. If you think about it, by that point, this is 1995, 1996, we'd only had 5 or 6 pros in history that had made it. Barry Hoban, you had Tommy Simpson, you had Brian Robinson, you had Chris Boardman, Sean Yates, and that was about it who had made it, like properly made it. And this is the mid late 90s, so it wasn't a trajectory that anybody could take.
Kind of night and day with today. Actually, there's so many. UK's had so much success recently.
Yeah, it's bonkers. So that's to put in perspective where it was when I was 18 years old in 1996. So I just went to France and I thought, well, if French 18-year-olds can do it, surely I can do it. And I went across, and thanks to Paul Sherwin, who helped me find a place in a team through one of his old teammates, VC Saint-Quentin. And I just rocked up there, didn't speak French, and in this banged up car, and this team, on Paul Sherwin's word, put me in, took me on board at the last minute, like mid-February. I'd been looking for teams all winter. No one would take me as this unknown Hong Kong kid. I got my ass kicked so bad in the first weekend of racing. I'd never ridden over 100 miles at that point, and the races were 160 Ks, 150 Ks. And I remember going to the phone box. It was a phone box across the road from in the village where I was, from the house where the team put me up. And I called up this Mike Taylor, who was my mentor. And I said, I don't think I can do this. And he said, hang on for 2 more weeks. And he said, it'll get better. He says, you never ridden over 100 miles before, it'll get better. And then sure enough, 2 weeks later, I was winning races. And then I just didn't stop. And I was just ripping races to pieces, like everywhere. I think I was like 23 times in the top 3 and won 8 big races. And by May that year, or June that year, I know it was May, June that year, Cyril Guimard came to the town and took me out for lunch. Then I had Vanessa, everybody wanting to recruit me as pro, and I was just this young 19-year-old that had no idea. It was crazy weird, but I just loved it. I loved the racing, loved it. I didn't see any of my friends, didn't socialize for 18 months, just went deep in.
The most important question is, what did the kit look like on that first team in Northern when you went to Northern France?
Yeah, you're gonna love this one. That's a really good. Can you remember AG2R Age Désert La Mondiale? It started off years ago as Chazal, and that's late 90s, neon green, and Veta. Veta was the co-sponsor. Look that baby up from 1997, 1998. It's
Is it the sort of fluoro pink
fluoro.
with neon green?
Exactly.
So I have it. I just Googled it. We'll
Yeah.
put it up on our Instagram.
Yeah,
Actually,
that was
there's
our kit because Veta was owned by this rich dude called Pascal Cordier, who was from Saint Quentin, who sponsored that team, and so the amateur team, VC Saint Quentin, we had the same livery.
It's actually pretty nice. I feel like
Yeah, in
maybe
hindsight,
3 or 4 years ago, there was a bit of a return of this sort of aesthetic in the market. I see some other Chazal kits that they made later, which are pretty bad, but the pink and kind of neon green yellowish one actually is a bit lamprey-ish when you look at it. It's a little bit reminiscent of that.
it was so good because I mean we stood out. We turned up to races, and it was even at that point it felt like retro 80s. Now it's ironic kind of colors, but at that point it was like, well, you guys are bright because no one had done neon colors on kits at that point. So we turned up to races and we were VC Saint Quentin and we were just neon AF.
I guess the Cofidis kit was a bit of a downgrade from the VC Saint-Quentin kit that
Yeah.
you were wearing before.
Yeah, Cofidis was a bit of, at the time it was a little bit, because they were one of the first teams to be kind of corporate owned, and they just were just one sponsor. Because up to that point, teams have been multi-sponsors. You'd had Z or Z, as North America would say, GAN, but it was quite rare to have teams that were just corporate owned. And Cofidis and FDJ were founded the same year, 1997, and they both had these very strong corporate branding, and they kept them. They've always kept them. I mean, I think this year has been the first time we've seen Cofidis change their kit in what, 25 years.
Both very strong title sponsors for many, many years, names that you just associate with cycling overall at this point, along with the likes of Quickstep and
Yeah, but they're not though. Quickstep's always got a secondary sponsor.
True.
Cofidis has never had a secondary sponsor. FDJ has never had a secondary sponsor. And we kind of forget that. The reason their kits are so pure is because they've just been owned by the company.
So you joined VC Saint-Quentin, you have a lot of success there, then you sign with Cofidis, and the rest of your career is kind of history. As I mentioned earlier, the multiple Grand Tour stage wins and the time trial prowess that you've displayed over the years. What of all the pro teams that you rode for, tell us a story about the one that had the ugliest kit that you had to wear during your pro career.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question on that one. It's Sonia Duval, which was the yellow kit. It wasn't before it got a bit better, but I got in there just as they were. So Sonia Duval signed me out of my ban in 2006, and they were the lowest budget World Tour team at the time. So they had the lowest budget World Tour kit. It was like a kind of a poorly done Jumbo Visma. And the worst thing was that in 2007, I got the polka dot jersey in the tour. And it was such a low budget team, we had no preparation for shorts. So I was wearing these yellow shorts with a polka dot jersey. I looked horrific. And it was a really seminal moment for me because it meant I remained the only British rider to have worn all leaders jersey at the Tour de France. But when I completed that, I looked like a licorice all sort. It was like really bad. And
it's true that yellow shorts with the polka dot jersey it's kind of
no.
like the McDonald's color palette there. It's pretty
Yeah, it
awful.
was, and hey, I know I told this story. I had it for 3 days, and who was a French rider who I knew, and actually I was like, you know what, go and get the points. I don't need to keep this anymore. I actually let him go and get it.
I'm trying to picture what like the green jersey would look, because green and yellow are not a great combo together, right? Because they're
What's
two.
that, Tony? That's the Phonak kit. That's
Yeah,
the
that's a two. Well, I
Phonak.
mean, the Phonak kit is legendary, but I'm sort of amazed you're allowed to wear yellow, because right now we have the Jumbo Visma have their special Tour de France they've just released, which is I don't know if you looked at it, but it's an insult to Van Gogh, Vermeer,
Yeah.
and
Is that the
uh,
poop kit, Tony?
that's the Phuket. But it's like a generative design of Van Gogh, Vermeer, and Rembrandt, and it is an insult to Van Gogh, Vermeer, and Rembrandt. It shows maybe why technology should be used sparingly in art and design, because it's taken three of the greatest painters of all time and just made it look like literal crap.
Yeah, one of our listeners noted the poop resemblance on that kit, so maybe it'll henceforth be referred to as the poop Jumbo Visma kit.
I was just looking up there. I was trying to find it. I got this vivid memory of the Tour de France. I think when it started in Liège, Bradley got he, he got the green jersey and he had this yellow helmet because his team had got team classification. So this yellow helmet, green jersey, and and he looked horrific, and you could tell he hated it. He's like, could tell he was like humiliated, and it was just because he did literally look like a Lego man, a badly put together Lego man. So,
So, David, when you sign with a pro team, so let's say Sonia Duval, right, worst team you've ever worn, were you contractually obligated to wear the kit at all times, even on your training rides at that time?
at the time you were, yeah, and also pro cyclists are frugal, and that's a nice way of saying incredibly tight, because most pro cyclists haven't bought kit or never bought kit. So they might not like it, but if they were to think, oh, you know what, I need to get something else, they'd go online or they go to a shop and they'd be like, yeah, no, there's no way this costs 200 euros or 300 euros. I'll just wear my crappy team kit, because you can get away with it. And if you go back to the early 2000s, in the kind of what the 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 Middle Ages, let's say, there became this kind of narrative that there'd be riders wearing black kit or non-team kit, and it's quite controversy because it meant they were hiding and they were kind of to try not to be caught by the anti-doping authorities. I mean, it's so stupid when you think of it now, that they thought that by wearing kind of block color kit, they'd avoid the anti-doping system and testers. But at the time, that became this kind of running theme that, oh, have you seen a pro in non-branded kit, non-team kit? They're doping. They're trying to hide. So it became this thing, and that kind of really set this thing that it was better to stay in your team kit, because if you didn't wear your team kit, even if you loved other stuff, and there weren't any other brands really at the time that would fulfill that, you'd almost be kind of implicating yourself in a doping scandal, even if you didn't dope. That was such a mad time. But otherwise, my go-to actually at the time, just go back, was Assos. I liked Assos in the late 90s. That's with Chapter 3, the first, where we had the button collar. I
We
bought,
hadn't yet
yeah,
seen the arrival of Assos Man at that time.
no, Assos Man didn't exist. It's like Assos was this kind of spiritual company there were no models. It was just pure product. It was like NASA. And I bought Assos and I was a junior, and I was training UK in really bad weather, and I kind of saved up and working in supermarket stacking shelves and bought my Assos kit to actually survive and be able to train. And he had this pop button collar, and it was fitted, and it was like it felt like you were an astronaut. And there was no of the stupid stuff they've done since. That was the only brand I ever chose outside kind of my career when I was young, and that's 25 years ago.
Speaking of pro kits, and you're right, the kind of timeline there, maybe Assos, but Rafa, I think, was about 2004. And then the sort of boom has only come in the last 4 or 5 years. What did you think of as a pro cyclist when you saw amateur cyclists, recreational cyclists out wearing a pro team kit? I mean, sometimes that might have been their only option or their own like personal club or whatever, but like, was it kind of this weird, like, thing? Because I mean, especially maybe if they were wearing your team kit. Now, I don't know if anybody would buy a Sonia Duval kit for their own if they had, proper vision, but was it a kind of a weird thing to see just some amateur guy riding around in Phonak, hopefully a Phonak
Mm.
kit.
Yeah, Phonak, cool.
We love the
I
Phonak kit.
Yeah, it's a classic. There's no doubt. I mean, I guess it's really hard to overemphasize how small cycling was when I was even at my peak. Kind of nobody really knew about it. So if you saw anybody out and they looked reasonably good, if they're a team kit, we didn't have FKW kind of at the time. They were fans. They loved the sport, and you just loved everybody who loved the sport. The kind of the hierarchy of judgment that didn't exist at the time. It's we all kind of knew we were outsiders and weirdos. And I think it's only over time, and every country has their different kind of protocols regards it. But even now, and especially in Girona where I live, because it's kind of a big kind of market for ex-pro cyclist kit, you'll see people out riding still Garmin from like 10 years ago, and it's nostalgic now. It's nice.
A listener actually asked us, because as you know, they were the global authority on cycling style here on this podcast. Listener asked us to provide the definitive answer of what is the statute of limitations on wearing pro kit? And Warren, I think we said 15 years, right? Or
10 years.
10
10
years.
years.
But it's got to be 10 years after the company stopped, or after the team stopped. I mean, I know there's some that have like gone out, like Covidis and FDJ and stuff, but like, I don't know if it could be 10 years while the company's going on.
Why don't you just put it at the same as the statute of limitations for doping, which is 8 years?
Actually, that would be, yeah, that would make sense.
And it's
But
just if they've done it for that, that's kind of makes sense. And you know, there's a life cycle. We always say life is a cycle of 7. So if you put 8 years, that's given a year kind of thinking time.
fair
So
enough. Maybe it's 8 years.
8 years, 8 years. And 8 years in Chinese is good fortune. 8. Listen.
David, so you go to Saunier Duval for a couple of years, then you join a team that is still in existence today, and actually one of the teams that's had some of the better kits, arguably in the pro peloton over the last few years, which is now EF Education First, which at that time I believe was called Slipstream, and you joined them in 2008. Now they've been known for good kits since then, but the 2008 Slipstream kit was maybe not their finest moment. And you said there was a story behind that kit with the Argyle, the light blue, and the orange as well. So can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I'd met JV, Jonathan Vaughters, and Doug Ellis, who was the owner, at the 2006 Tour de France presentation in October. And I spent most of the next year, and I became an owner of that team, a co-owner of that team with them. And I spent the whole year kind of on the ground recruiting riders. And they already had that Argyle design, which is very JV, and it was quirky and very much JV. And I had nothing against that. But what we did, and it was very clever, we asked the fans we created a competition to create our jersey in 2007. And I think it was on Twitter, and the Twitter barely existed. And it was actually, I'm not sure how we did it because Instagram didn't exist. We must have done some internet kind of thing because social media barely was there. We got loads of amazing kit designs in 2007 for 2006 for 2007 kit. Christian Vandervelde and I were we were getting all these, and I was seeing all of them. There were some super amazing ones. I mean, I was kind of more going down the like black and flames sort of rock racing style, which I know you guys are big fans of. But JV chose this absolutely horrific, and he totally vetoed everything, and chose the kit that they had to wear, not me. I was an owner of a team. I didn't have to wear the kit that he chose because I was national champion at the time. I was national champion in on road and time trial and international and 4K. I was in the first time anyone had ever done it. I had all national championships in the UK. And I do question whether my motivation for winning all those national championships was to avoid wearing that kit. But it meant that in 2008, I was pure white, and this is so good because the national and all my teammates that I'd recruited and signed up to this kind of abstract kind of misfit team were in this horrific kit, and it was Pearl Azumi, and it was badly made, and it looks like a kind of a horrible pastiche of tartan and different things. And I was in my pure white kit, and then the national championships, because in cycling, it's the national championships are held generally the weekend before the Tour de France across the whole world, apart from the US, Australia, and a few other countries. And that's where I didn't defend it. And then I had to change, and I was like, I'm gonna have to go back to that kit, but I didn't, because that's when Garmin came on board, and we got this one of the best kits in cycling from that moment on. So I avoided that whole train crash. But if you go and look it up, it's a pretty bad kit, and I'll happily say that.
Did you wear the white bibs when you were British national champion?
I did for 6 months. I went white bibs. I had full white speed suit for time trial. Unfortunately, the constructions weren't good enough for it to work consistently. You know, it would go invisible quickly. It wasn't, it'd get dirty. It wouldn't hold, you know, it held dirt. But yeah, and then I did both. I did full white for 6 months, and then I did black shorts classic for the second half.
I'm so upset to know that we could have had another kind of rock racing, but actually in the like World Tour peloton, that style you're saying, black and flames. I need to see that. Like, if considering the Pro Tour obviously can't really follow the sort of minimalist approach because of sponsorships, and they want to be seen, you know, out in breakaways and in the peloton stuff. I like the idea of going like full board, like just a really because you can't do a solid blocking jersey, you might as well go wild with it. That's what I like in the pro peloton.
I'm with you. And you know what? I've got this complete, and I've had this with our head of design, Ella, who's amazing. I've got this whole Tron fetish, and I just haven't got it out yet. Is doing this super Tron kit. And if I had a pro team, I would go full Tron. But the Tron would be, there'd be lines everywhere, and they obviously reflective. So if they'd have the lines there, and they'd look great and be very flattering and elegant and make you look fast. But if you use one of those flashes, daylight flashes, it would just, and it would be crazy. And if you link that with a bike, holy shit. That's my dream that I'm yet to fulfill, is create a pro Tron kit. And then you could go super crazy, because imagine with Peloton, you can, there's got to be the tech to be able to make it light up. And so you just be racing around and troned up. It's not there yet. And everyone's being too boring. Everyone's being retro.
Is that sort of like the Biarritz kit you have right now with Chapter 3? Because like
Yeah,
it's a little Tron-like to me.
that's Tron-like. I mean, that was a kind of more classical, kind of high fashion Biarritz
It had a
Chanel style.
Chanel sort of vibe to me.
Yeah, well, it's
Like a
exactly.
classic Chanel sort of dress was kind of like that.
Oh yeah.
That was the whole idea of corsetry, because Chanel's first atelier was in Biarritz. And when I was 24 and I came into some money and I was wanting to buy a home, I came this close to buying Coco Chanel's atelier as my first apartment. And I decided to buy a house and be practical and be boring, and so I could have a garage and stuff. But I'm an absolute geek regards fashion and all those things. And Coco Chanel started her business in Biarritz. And she also, the Chanel No. 5 bottle was designed there because she was having an affair with a Russian aristocrat who, his eau de cologne was in a bottle like that. And so she actually took the inspiration for the Chanel No. 5 bottle from the Russian aristocrat that she was hanging out with in Biarritz. And so it just felt nice that kind of to do something a little bit left field again with that kit that the Biarritz kit we did with Chapter 3 was very much not just a homage to Chanel, it's a homage to the fact you can do amazing stuff with performance and tech. You can bring art and design to performance and tech if it's done properly. And that one it's got the most incredible construction to it. It's all recycled fabric. It's got this sort of piping. I mean, you look at it and you can see that it's taking a lot of time to work. And I guess in many ways, Warren, that's sort of prototype to what I'd one day like to do with racing. Is just, but without all that heavy construction, which the Biarritz kit is.
I was going to bring up the fact that when you, and this is maybe the segue into Chapter 3 and the history of you starting it, but when you look at Chapter 3 compared to a lot of the other cycling brands out there, you know, it doesn't surprise me that you say that you're a geek about the history of fashion and fashion design overall, because when you look at Chapter 3, the clothing looks very tailored. And the 1.21 jersey with the buttons on, for me, I work in a field where I've actually worn a lot of tailoring to go to work, and it seems like very Savile Row inspired, very structured, very military inspired overall, compared to other types of tailoring, Italian, which might be a little looser, a little destructured, and so on. So it doesn't really surprise me that you say you're a fan of the history of fashion, because it definitely feels like that's reflected in the chapter 3 designs that you guys have.
Yeah, it was. And I mean, I think going back to the fact that I was brought up as a military kid, so my dad was always wearing uniforms, and I was surrounded by that. And then in Hong Kong, I was introduced to tailoring. It's very accessible. Like my school uniforms are tailored. I go to tailors and get everything done. Like, so there was also that juxtaposition for me, because in Hong Kong you had that really like street fashion vibe. I've always worn baggy jeans and kind of very streetwear, but from Hong Kong Asian fashion, and which has always been kind of a little bit. I was never mod. I never followed what Europe was doing, or even the States, and I was always just Asian urban wear, which I loved. But then that was juxtaposed with my love of tailoring. And so I guess with chapter 3, when we started it in 2015, it was literally tailored, in the sense we went to Timothy Everest, who is my tailor, as crazy as that sounds, a Savile Row tailor, and he helped us cut and make the collars and do the things. And with Steve Smith, the boss of Castelli, who was all in on this, we kind of decided to take my love of clothing and change it. And if you look back at chapter 3, 2015, we were doing stuff that nobody had ever done before. We went block colors, no branding. I mean, we went to the extreme where we had all the buttons, but we were using fabrics no one had used before. So Castelli, because we were collaborating with Castelli, and it was kind of, we were their skunk works and the pet project of Steve Smith, who's the boss of Castelli. And with Steve Smith, we'd spent the previous 10 years. So I met Steve Smith in 2005 when he just was rebooting Castelli. And with Steve Smith, we spent 10 years on and off at the beginning. Then I went to Perla Zumi, then I came back to Castelli. But I was the first person to wear an Aero jersey. The Aero jersey doesn't exist. I was the first person to use that. The San Remo suit, I was the first person to use that. The speed suits we started doing, I was the first person to do that. The overshoes we were doing, the different fabrics. And I was kind of, Steve and I got on so well because I was always feeding him ideas for kind of increasing performance. And he knew I'd always test it. So Castelli had this crazy relationship with Steve Smith. So when it came to the end of my racing career, and this was the Vuelta a España in 2014, I I spoke to Steve and said, look, I want to do something different. Would you be willing to kind of help me build something? And I said, I don't want to use my name, because my name's like Marmite, saying you could, people love and hate me. And I came outside this name, chapter 3. I said, I want to make apparel that I'll wear as a non-racer. And so that was where the whole military colors going. Steve and I visited Timothy Everest in his atelier. And because even Steve's seamstress and pattern cutters couldn't come up with the collar we wanted for the rocker jacket, because the rocker jacket is very much, it's got two things to it which are just insane. It's got that collar, the reversible collar, and that's very much a cavalry jacket. And only Savile Row tailors know how to make cavalry jackets, because that's what they were doing. So that's how we built that reversible button collar. Then it's got the, like a shooting jacket. So we've got the shoulders that have they've got this kind of crazy, almost a sharp edge to them. And then it's got this internal seam, then it comes down. And it went down just the elbows. So I was like, you don't need full length for this, just go elbows. And what Steve did, which was incredible, was that he spoke to Gore-Tex, and Gore-Tex did their first ever two-tone apparel for it. Because I wanted it to be military green on the outside and fire red on the inside. So it had these real contrasts. And Gore had never done a two-tone before. And that became Gore Rain or Shine. And it wasn't released to the main market, that fabric, till 2 years later. But it was pretty crazy, because when I showed my dad it, when it was finished, he was like, oh, that's, what was it called? An MA2 jacket. And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, that's what pilots wear. It's, if you crash, you take it off and you reverse it. So you're wearing fire red so you can be found. And I was like, oh, shit. I had no idea that all the things I was doing were actually so much military from my background, from growing up in a military background, and then the performance from spending so much time in racing, and then my love of tailoring. And that's where chapter 3 came from. It was this kind of real mashup of those three elements.
That's really interesting. It's actually very different from a lot of the kit that you see on the market today, because there definitely is a heritage behind the story of chapter 3, your love of tailoring, the military influence, whereas I feel like certain other brands out there don't necessarily have all that philosophy behind it. They're just more focused on producing whatever it happens to be popular at the moment.
We've mentioned it before, and there's a lot of follow the leader in cycling, where sort of one company takes a certain cut or kind of color palette, and the next thing you know, kind of companies in that same strata kind of become very similar shortly after.
Yeah, because I mean, in 2015, one of I think the craziest thing we did, beyond the actual products, was the photo shoot we did with Nadav Kanda. It was a studio shoot. He's a friend of mine, and he normally you wouldn't be able to do that because it's so expensive. And I didn't want any bikes in it. I didn't want any lifestyle shots. So I was like, we're just gonna hero the clothing. And at the time, and this is 2015, Paz Normal, we're just doing, or penis, we're just doing we're literally carbon copying Rafa. And I was like, why would you do that? Now, in hindsight, I wish I'd done that because I realized that people like the same thing. But we did all that really weird shit. And then everyone started taking that. And Rafa were the first people to copy our photo shoots. And then everyone started to copy our colors and our blocks. And we were too small to actually follow through with the ambition. Kind of, and that's very much where chapter 3 sits. We kind of, because I'm so protective of it and still learning, and kind of it's the biggest university degree of my life. I don't like following, and perhaps the last year we've had to because we've been transitioning. But otherwise, very much for chapter 3. Chapter 3 for me is about disrupting, because that's what cycling represents for me. You got to disrupt. You can't follow.
And you started chapter 3 in a very different competitive landscape than, say, when Rafa started. And we often talk
Mm.
about how, credit to Rafa in the sense that if there hadn't been a Rafa, there probably wouldn't be this podcast, because the kit before Rafa was sort of an afterthought. People would buy anything. Yeah.
Chapter 3 wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for Rafa. I was at one of their first fundraising dinners in 2004. I mean, I'm good friends with Simon Mottram. I've been in the whole journey with them and always been a big supporter of them. And you know what? The deeper I get into this, the more admiration I have for them, or for what Simon Mottram did. But you're right. I mean, it was a time and the place, but still, you got to do it. They were at the time. It seemed pretty bonkers what they were doing, but they've done it really well. Now, whether it represents cycling anymore, I don't know, but it's pretty amazing what they've accomplished.
So actually, let's talk about the competitive landscape today. Are there some brands out there that obviously looking at things from your own perspective of having started chapter 3 and being, as you say, a bit of a disruptor, are there some brands that whose products and work you enjoy out there at the moment?
Yeah, there's quite a few. I mean, I know this is a hot take. I actually love
You've come to the
Castelli.
right place.
Yeah, I love Castelli. I know everyone kind of hates them because of they're everywhere, but if there's one brand that's just pure racing, it's Castelli. And I know it doesn't come across. You wear Castelli and you feel a bit cheap these days, I think. At the same time, and I know them intimately, all they care about is racing.
So we've actually been on the record on this podcast that we like Castelli, we like the heritage, we like the brand as a whole. Everybody loves the GABA; it's a great product. What we struggle with respect to Castelli on Cycling Fashion Week is the logo. We just don't like the scorpion. But the product itself, if they change the logo, I would love Castelli.
I did this, as I said before, I listened to the archive. So I called up Steve Smith, the boss of Castelli, before this to find out about the scorpion. And apparently none of them know. But the closest they get to knowing is that Maurizio, who was one of the last family owners, he was a bit of a ladies' man, and he hadn't this woman that he fell in love with was a Scorpio, and so just to screw his family around, he put a scorpion on there. So that's the most Italian story ever, if kind of that's what it is. It's got nothing to do with anything else apart from one of the original family owners, his girlfriend, her star sign was Scorpio,
I feel like these need to be disseminated because now that makes like the logo from a purely aesthetic is still ugly. I'm not gonna go on
Yeah.
that, but the story behind it being so Italian and this kind of like affair and romance sort of like just gives it a little bit more than what is this random logo. So it's like I don't know. That's a pretty good story.
I feel like it's right up our alley, Tony.
Yeah.
Okay, David, you live in Girona. David, I think you. How long have you lived in Girona?
16 years. Yeah.
Wow, so you were among the first ones to make the move to Girona because it feels like now it's become a pros and an ex-pros kind of spiritual home with respect to cycling. But Girona is also home to what I would call the influencer phenomenon, or it does seem like influencers gravitate, or cycling influencers, I should say, gravitate around Girona, take selfies. Tell us a little bit about that and how you feel about this whole kind of culture when it comes to cycling.
Ugh, it's quite complicated. I guess the chimp in me wants to say one thing, but the human in me kind of has to be careful. I mean, came to Drona because there was nobody here, and that's why I lived in Biarritz as well. I lived in Biarritz because there were no pro cyclists here. So after my band came to Drona, because it wasn't Nice, it wasn't Monaco, it wasn't Tuscany, it wasn't Belgium, it wasn't Valencia. And so I always went to the places where few people went, and that's how I love my cycling, was to be on my own. And so then and I felt like a late adopter when I arrived here because it was on the back of the US Postal Lance Armstrong crew. So it's Lance, George, Levi, Dave Zabriskie, Christian Vandervelde, Floyd. That whole group were the kind of here, and then JV, and it's Christian Vandervelde that got me here. Then they all left, and I brought the Slipstream here and brought that whole team here. And then over the years, it was nice, lots of bike racers, but it was a bit cliquey. But everyone left in the winters, and it was just me and Michael Barry for a while, and then Michael Barry left, and it was just me and Nicole here. And now it's like Instagram's vomited on Drona. It's kind of it's like it's really, and I'm quite uncomfortable about it. Have you ever seen that Seinfeld? Oh no, it wasn't Seinfeld. It was Curb Your Enthusiasm, like the stop and chat. It's like don't do the stop and chat. So I kind of have this thing in Drona, and I people must just think I'm an absolute weirdo because I try to avoid eye contact. I never stop and chat. If I'm with my wife, she'll always stop and chat, and I just I'm doing half steps away and trying to get out of there and then just walk away because I didn't move to Girona for stop and chats or for selfies or for meeting people and hanging out. And that's what cycling's become. And it's really uncomfortable to say because I know that's why it's booming so big now, because all these people are here to come and hang out and lifestyle the shit out of it. But I did it to get away from everybody. And so I have this real tension between what drone has become and why I came here. But I love it because I know they'll all leave.
You're a man after Alex's heart. This is Alex's life. He's got a country house. He got a country house in the eastern townships of Quebec. He likes to ride on his own. He doesn't need other people. He doesn't talk to many
Look,
people.
my best mileage is done alone in the rolling hills with the cows looking at me. That's the best time when I'm kind of focusing on my thoughts. That's the true escape for me. Whereas these two guys, they live for the community ride and the coffee stop and all of this, which I'm okay doing it once in a while, but I'm like you. I also like cycling to just get away from
Well, if
everything.
you see the roads in Toronto, which I know Alex has, but David probably hasn't, I mean, you have to find something to kind of like make cycling tolerable and a decent group of people. Now, I don't go on everything, but a couple people that you like can do it because there are no beautiful rolling hills or
Yeah.
views. It's industrial plants you ride by. You need to kind of chat with, have a good conversation with someone is the way to make your 100K tolerable.
We have one rolling hill, and it takes 40K to get to it and 40K to come back.
Well, well, they took the worlds away from me, but I won a worlds in Hamilton, so I kind of saw the distant Toronto in Hamilton, and yeah, but I never got close to it. Here's a question for you guys. So this is something that really I've been thinking about because all brands these days, and I think all companies are always told about building community, and especially in cycling. But it's really difficult for me to build a community because obviously I'm like Alex and find it quite hard to build community. But is there a space for a brand that is anti-community? You know, that's what I mean. It's a really, because Path's normal, they're doing all their shit. You got Rafa with all their clubs. You got La Passione, kind of, I don't know what they're doing. Nicole with their club and just spanking money on everything. All these brands doing these different things, but they're all doing the same thing.
Last episode, we were actually discussing how sort of PNS seems to be doing it with respect to the community, where they have this whole big kind of influencer get together in Mallorca and then talk a lot about the community. But then Warren and Tony were saying that in the Toronto community, there sort of isn't much of a community there. So it seems to be a bit of a disconnect between what is said and what is actually done. I think for me, I think for a brand that would pitch itself as not necessarily anti-community, but saying cycling is alternative, cycling is an individual sport, is something that you do to get away from it. I think that's a very strong story that speaks to me personally.
So my day job is in advertising, David. Like
Mm.
our listeners, I don't think even know that. I don't talk about it much. But in my mind, that's sort of probably the inevitable reaction to all of these brands taking on this community thing. Because yeah, we were talking about how Panorama in Toronto is a bit more elitist exclusive, but I wouldn't call it anti-community, because in my mind, anti-community is like, yeah, more about like the solo hard rides, the Belgian hard man, hard person. Like, so I think it's probably just a matter of time until a brand does take that up, whether it's an existing brand, maybe a smaller one, probably not somebody like Map or Rafa, but
But I was going to say that Rafa, I felt that Rafa was actually sort of early on advertising to that way. Like I remember there was one of the Rafa films years and years ago they had released called Van Diemen's Land, which is what they used to call Tasmania. And it was just like the kind of, they had that very sort of, the Rafa styles come to know sort of panorama outcomes. And it was this idea, kind of what Warren's saying, this sort of solitude, hard man in this sort of tough weather, and that kind of, it's an individual thing. It's you against your mind. And it felt like companies kind of were doing that. And then something happened. I don't know, market research or something, that now it has to be community riding, everyone together. So I think there's a space for it because people liked it back then.
This is going to blow your minds here. You might know it. Do you know what the stripe is on the Rafa arm?
no.
I don't actually.
This is going to blow your minds. Prisoners of the Road. So they kind of, when they started, they were very much that, Tony, that kind of idea where it was all the suffering, the black and whites. That was the kind of crying into an espresso on the side of a mountain. That was kind of the Rafa. We're on our own. We're finding ourselves through the glory and suffering. And so they took the idea of kind of prison stripes, but they just left one stripe and it's on your arm. You're a prisoner of the road. That was the original Rafa kind of brand concept, which is pretty nuts. But then jumping from that, going back to what you were just saying, Warren, is Paul Smith, Sir Paul Smith, the designer, has this great line which I've always loved regards what he does. He says, "We don't do fashion, we do individuality," which is so what he does and what they do. This why cycling fashion week is so important, and that we have you leading the global movement is because people need to understand what cycling fashion is, because nobody does, because everyone's just like lemmings following the latest fashion. We're losing individuality. We're losing that ability to, why it all started was to be different and to kind of be you can be something different. You don't have to go and all dress the same in the same pastel natural colors with letters on you.
What you're saying reminds me of Tony and I had this friend in Toronto named Sean, who's a cyclist, but he's a fashion designer like by trade. He doesn't really follow the cycling trends. Like his sense of style is so good. He'll just roll up to a ride in like this crazy combination of brands and colors that I would never be bold enough to try, but he makes it work because his fashion sense is good. So that's the kind of thing, to your point, is maybe kind of missing, because it's easy to look at like, the latest Map or PNS lookbook and be like, oh, I can just
Yeah.
buy that and throw it on and I'll look fine. But like he comes up with these like wild looks and it's just like,
and that's interesting because we've talked about it before, and he's kind of been my example of like how, I mean, he actually even makes some of his own stuff because he can sew, but how, you know, mixing and matching brands and kind of putting an outfit together is kind of like the ultimate in showing you have style. And we got a message from someone, or might have been a comment, basically saying like, no, you have to buy all the same. Like if you wear something, it's got to be all the same brand. So like if you're gonna wear a, you know, Panormal jersey, then you have to, you can't put a map and then an attacker, you know, socks. Like it's all got to be the same. And it's kind of like, but then that's not really style. Like that's not this kind of, there's no creativity. Like
Yeah.
obviously we don't own a brand that we can make whatever we want. We have to buy what's available, but the style comes from buying multiple things and saying, how do I put this together uniquely?
Yeah. And I was just thinking, it's like, I got 3 kids, 3 young kids, 10, 8, and 6, and I love reading them books. And there's a book called Odd Dog Out. And it's like, it's just, they, you know, they're always like kind of mini fables or metaphors for life. And it's like this dog that just, it can't fit in because everyone dresses the same. And so they leave someone every, it's just, you look it up. It's such a good story because it's such an analogy for where cycling is right now. And I'll be totally transparent here. We did it because with Chapter 3, when we left our Castelli collaboration, we made the leap out to make our own products. And that was last year in the midst of COVID. And I copped out slightly. I went fully sustainable because we're fully recycled. Like, I mean, the stuff we do is nuts how sustainable you are. And we don't talk enough about that. But I got scared and went down the kind of block colors and all these different things. And even with our photography, went a bit more normal. And I think I referenced to you guys, it, looking back, it feels a little bit like shit Benetton, what we were doing last year. But it wasn't kind of what we are and what Chapter 3 represents. And it's been a really big wake up call to me, seeing I thought we needed to be the same. And that's why we created the Biarritz collection, was to go, actually, no, we're not the same. Kind of, it's Odd Dog Out. And so that's what Chapter 3 is. And we need to figure out how to kind of find that again and encourage people not to be intimidated by cycling. Because if you turn up to a group ride, if you're a Mallorca at the PNS influencer thing and you saw them turn up, you'd be terrified of cycling. You'd be like, oh, I'm not skinny enough, I'm not wearing the right stuff. So there's this fine line between, I always like to think of cycling as being eccentric and kind of eccentric, and it's the home for the weirdos, it's the home for the interesting people, it's the home for the individuals. So I've got this real conundrum because I know for our brand we need to build a community, but how do we build a community that embraces individuality? And that's where fashion's important, because fashion's about style. It's not about, and it's about individuality. It's not about conformity. It's not about having to wear a uniform. And so, yeah, it's I'm finding it really kind of interesting at the moment and challenging, because the vibe now is that in many ways, I think there's loads of normal people riding bikes. We're losing the eccentrics. We're losing the cool, interesting people because they're scared, because they don't want to wear the same thing as everybody else. And it feels like now you have to wear the same thing as everybody else. If I was at 18 now or 15, I wouldn't want to be a cyclist. I'd be like, I don't want to hang out with all those people. They all look the same.
See, you just made a huge plea for rock racing here.
Huge plea. Yeah. Huge plea.
Okay, David, we're gonna wrap up the interviews. We do this with every guest. We'll
Yeah.
do rapid fire questions. So I ask you questions. There's usually 2 choices, or you feel free to bring up another choice, and you can give us a quick answer as to why you picked that. So I'll start with the first question. What's your number 1 pro kit of all time?
Anything that Andre Darrigat wore, whatever he wore, he looked amazing. And he encapsulates just what cycling was in the 50s and 60s. And if you go through and look up Andre Darrigat, he won 27 stages at Tour de France. He was Biarritz, kind of French, the most dignified. He's cycling. He's like the anti Bradley Wiggins, you know. It's kind of, he's class.
Best pro kit in today's peloton.
I think I have to go for Age Desert.
Yes,
I think
good
A
answer.
favorite,
Yeah,
a favorite.
I
Yeah.
feel
cycling
vindicated.
Yeah.
White or black shoes? White or black socks?
White. Oh, black socks if it's raining. White, black if it's raining.
So, David, you've lived in a bunch of places. You've lived in Hong Kong, France, Spain, the UK. Which country has the best style on the bike?
Hong Kong. People get dressed to the nines.
Favorite pro race that you raced?
La Vuelta a España.
Really?
Ooh.
I just love it. As a bike racer, it's the best race. It's just so much fun.
I know this is supposed to be the quick answer question, but could you quickly just say why it's like fun or better?
Yeah, because I could go there. We didn't have any of the. I was on a French team or an American. All the pressure after Tour de France was gone, and most people flaked out. And I used to go to the Volta to race my bike as just a pure bike racer without any of the pressure. And it was just. And it's Spain. The vibe was amazing.
Now, this question is really for me. Is the biggest regret of your pro career never having raced the Grand Prix Cycliste de Montréal and therefore never having climbed the hardest col in the world, the Côte Camignaud in Montreal? How do you feel about that, David?
You know what? I do actually regret that because one of my best friends is Ryder Hesjedal, and being able to go to a bike race with him in Canada would have been a joy. And I've never been to Montreal. Oh no, I have been to Montreal. I went there for a World Anti-Doping Agency conference, but it was snowy, and I do regret that, to be honest with you, Alex. I would have loved to have raced the classic, the greatest classic.
It's the greatest classic of all
Yeah.
time. It
Yeah.
beats Paris-Roubaix.
Yeah.
It really
Yeah.
is good. Actually, David, we're recording this in late April, and we just got 15 centimeters of snow today, so it's
Standard.
pre-bag cycling.
Yeah.
But again, speaks to the fact that Camignaud
Yeah,
is the
yeah.
hardest climb in the world. There's snow on
Yeah.
top of it,
Yeah.
just like the Stelvio. Okay, so important question. So you're familiar with Cycling Fashion Week. We throw a lot of stuff in the Canal. Is there something you would like to throw on the Canal? We throw this opportunity out to every guest that comes on the podcast. So if there's something you'd like to throw in the Canal, this is your moment.
Disc brakes. I hate disc brakes. Yeah. I find
From a functional perspective or aesthetic point of view?
No, functional. It's like I've said this since the beginning. I've never had a problem stopping on a bike. That's like the easiest thing to do on a bike is stop. It's, and especially with modern kind of caliper brakes, if you've got the right brake pads with the right rim surface, you can brake in all weathers. It feels like it's over engineering, it adds weight, it removes the elegance. A bike should be a beautiful piece of simple engineering. The moment you bring oil and hydraulics, a bike doesn't need oil and hydraulics. My bike that I ride now is a Factor 02, which has 2014 Dura-Ace mechanical and caliper brakes, and it's a beautiful bike. And I got disc bikes, and I got these things, and honestly, they're the bane of my life. They're a fucking nightmare.
So I take it you're not a Di2 guy either. You're a
I got
mechanical
Di2,
shift.
but I know for my own personal bike, my bike that I rely on without fail, it's mechanical Dura-Ace.
So I agree with you. I mean, the look of rim brakes, I've gone on record, is just the way to go, the look. But from a practicality standpoint, at first I was like, I got a cross bike with disc brakes. I thought this is really great. You kind of feel that stuff. And then on my road bike, I have disc brakes. A little bit was, practicality and maybe a bit of future proofing. But recently I had some brake rub. And if I had, any of that kind of stuff on a rim brake bike, I could fix it sort of very quickly, easily myself. It spent me like 6 hours, and afterwards I felt I was a master mechanic. And that's something that's bothered me about like the modern road bike. It's getting further and further away from being able to just do stuff yourself very easily with sort of a basic set of tools. And with my bike prior to the Marinoni, it was just a kind of simple aluminum Scott, everything threaded. I could fix the whole thing. I could recable and fix the whole thing by myself, and I am not a good mechanic within like an hour.
It's ruining it, disc brakes. It's the beginning of the end. That's not why we got into cycling.
Influencer culture and disc brakes getting
That's
together
it.
to
That's
destroy
it.
cycling.
It's the beginning of the end. Influencer culture and disc brakes, and tubeless tires. Yeah,
Yes, Warren has
yes,
been on that.
100%.
Yes.
I agree with you there. 100%.
tubeless
Terrible.
tires.
I hate
It's
them.
like they just keep going down, and I just keep taking them back to the bike shop. So I'm like, I'm not touching this shit. I'm not gonna stick fluid in my tires. That's just makes no sense to me. The air goes in there, not liquid, before it was so simple. You just pumped it up and changed brake pads, and now it's like liquids all over the place. Cycling is about air. It's not about liquid.
David Miller, thank you very much for coming on Cycling Fashion Week on the podcast today. It was a true pleasure to hear your hot takes that you brought to the podcast, but also to hear about your approach to cycling style and chapter 3 as well. So we're very honored to call you a friend of the podcast. And whenever there's something you want to say about cycling style, you're welcome to come back anytime you want.
Well, thank you very much, guys, because honestly, you guys are, we need you. The whole global cycling community needs you three to keep doing this and do it weekly, because everyone's lost track. Everyone's gone mad. So thank you.
Okay, it's not because we have distinguished guests on the podcast that we are not going to throw stuff in the canal, because that is a bi-weekly occurrence. We throw the stuff we don't like from the cycling and the cycling fashion world into Montreal's La Chine Canal. And actually this week, guys, I will start, if you don't mind, I'll go very quickly. What's in the canal for me is snow in late April. Last weekend was my birthday weekend. And what I like to do on my birthday is I like to do for an extra long ride. And last few years, I've generally been able to do it. It was pretty cold, and I was able to spend, 3-4 hours on the bike. It was pretty good. But this weekend, it snowed all weekend. And here I am, late April in Montreal, and it was a massive snowstorm a couple of days ago, and it just feels like absolute garbage to put the bike back on the trainer and to fire up Zwift again when I thought I was done until next November or December. So that's what's in the canal for me. Tony, what do you got in the canal this week?
Everything here we talk about is kit, shoes, hats, helmets, sorry, caps, I apologize. Caps, helmets, whatever. But one of the key components of cycling style is actually your style on the bike and the way you ride. Now, some of that can come down to fit. We think, you should make sure your bike fits properly, but some of it is just purely the function of your body. And so I saw recently a guy powering down the road. He had a strong tailwind because I had a very strong headwind and he was going the opposite way. He was grinding away at 40 RPM, like bouncing on the bike. It just looked awful. I'm sure a coach would tell you it's also a really inefficient way to ride, that low of cadence. But like, I think the way you ride the bike is so important for your style. So I'm throwing shitty cadence, usually lower cadence, but sometimes people spin way too high.
Tony, 2 words, Chris Froome.
Well, Lance did say spinning is winning, so I don't know if you can spin too high.
Lance says over 100 RPM is inefficient.
Yeah.
So,
but anyways, I'm throwing bad cadence, which is sort of analogous to bad form on the bike. Not only should your kit look beautiful, your bike should look beautiful, your hair, everything, your physical body and the way you ride your bike should look beautiful. So I'm throwing bad cadence into the canal.
what gear would you have to be running to be doing 40 RPM in a tailwind?
I don't know what that guy. I mean, maybe it was 60. You were on the ride with me, weren't you?
Yeah, I was.
Yeah.
But
Maybe it was 60, but it was just like, it was insane. And I was like, and it just the way his body was moving on the bike was so efficient, like he was bouncing back and forth.
he looked like he was having a bad time.
Yeah, which is odd. Tailwinds when cycling is fun.
Okay, Warren, what do you got in the canal this week?
My canal for this week is actually it relates to what we talked about last episode. We did a big discussion on brand ambassadors, brand summits. We kind of singled out Panorama a little bit, maybe a bit unfairly, but I did want to just talk about, because one thing I've personally seen, and I have a feeling it may be common with a lot of these brand ambassadors, I'm going to throw into the canal selling the kit you get for free from your brand sponsors on buy and sell groups on Facebook or online or whatever. Because if you're a brand ambassador and you're getting a bunch of free kit and you're taking all this content and posting on Instagram, but then you're turning around and selling it as lightly used or basically new or nearly perfect or whatever, and you're selling it for almost retail price, like also relates to what we talked about at the top of this episode about used bike prices being insane. It's all sorts of shady and shitty behavior in my opinion, and probably against whatever contract you might have as a brand ambassador. So I don't even know if this is on the up and up. It's probably not, especially if you're getting your partner to do it for you. But I'm throwing that in the canal because, like, if some company is giving me free kit, first of all, thank you. Yes, send it to us. If I don't want it, or if first of all, buying used kit is kind of gross, especially bibs. I personally don't do that. But my first instinct is, if I'm done with kit, is to give it to somebody. Give it to somebody who's new to cycling, or to maybe somebody who can't afford to buy a new kit right now, or their kit's a little worn or something. That's what we should be doing with it. Why do you need to sell kit you got for free at a reasonably high price? Just give it to somebody you know. I don't know. That's what I'm throwing in the canal. Like, it just it seems wrong.
Because you got to rise and grind, get this bread, right? Everyone's a hustler now. There's no more altruism, right? You've got it. You've got to hustle, baby. Make the dollar every way you can. People are very proud of that kind of stuff. And so,
Just on a practical level, I personally would not wear, let alone buy, bibs that were worn by someone else.
no.
What if
No.
that person is prone to saddle sores? Without getting into the details, I'm not wearing those bibs. Sorry.
Even still, like, I saw a wind jacket, for example, that I am about 95% sure was used by a brand ambassador for sale on the local group. And, it was used for a season, perfect condition. First of all, that is not perfect condition. That is a season's use of the product. And the price was like, I want to say 2/3 or 3/4 of retail. If you're going to spend hundreds of dollars on an expensive wind jacket, why wouldn't you just spend the extra like 50 to $100 and buy brand new? Like, so I don't even know if anyone's buying this kit at that price. I just, mind boggling to me. But yeah, absolutely would never buy used bibs. But even that stuff is just like, maybe if you're getting a great deal, sure, I totally get that. But if you're not getting a deal, and it's sort of what Tony was talking about with the used bike prices, it's like, you've used this. Even if you got it for free, you've used it. You have got value out of this item. Why do you need to try to like monetize and capitalize off?
I said this at the top of the show when we were talking about the bikes, but it's like it's the same thing with the kid, and I just need to reiterate it because I don't understand how literally everything sold has only been used 2 times or barely used or ridden. Right? You see some bike that's got the the spokes of the wheel broken. 3 rides, 200K. Like, it's like nobody's, every time you sell something, it's barely nearly new. And it's just like, so I mean, there is a case. I'm sure a lot of people buy bikes that they think they're going to get into. They don't. They ride a few 100K and then they realize they don't. But like, I feel like every time I see something, there'll be some, Dura A 7900 mini group set, barely ridden. The whole crank has got a scratch. Shimano's not even on the crank. Dura Ace isn't even on the crank anymore. Like, it's such a weird marketing ploy.
I saw a jersey for sale on this group once. Not what I'm talking about specifically, but just a jersey for sale that said nearly mint condition. There's a hole in the shoulder, and there was a hole the size of a quarter on like the rear shoulder. And I actually comment, like, I don't like I have a Facebook account solely to be able to creep used bike listings. I have 0 friends on it, don't use my real name, etc. But I literally commented on that post to be like, that is not the definition of nearly mint. There is a hole in the jersey, and the seller responded saying, it's like, it's open to interpretation what you think mint is. It's like, that is not even used. That is in need of repair.
I've got a 97 Toyota Corolla, no engine, nearly mint.
Going back to this idea that the fact that, like, it's one thing for people in general to be selling things at like these outrageous prices, claiming it's not used or anything. It's another to be a brand ambassador for a brand. You are supposed to be representing the brand. And I get they're probably sending you new kit every season. That's great. You've got this excess kit. Give it away, first of all. But also, like, I don't think that's a very good look on you or the brand. Probably it's just, you're giving the kit away. The brand probably wouldn't be happy to know that's happening, but I mean, that's your own whatever thing. And like, Tony and I briefly had a cycling team that we were organizing sponsors for. We had a kit sponsor lined up, and I took one look at the contract for our kit sponsor and what they wanted us to do in exchange for like one free kit, and it was a lot of work. So we ended up just folding that team and not doing it, largely because of the amount of Instagram posts we would have been expected to make. Anyway, but contracts exists for between brand and brand ambassadors, and I would imagine there's probably a clause in there like, don't sell this.
I would love to see a contract. Like, if there's anyone listening who's like a brand ambassador or a brand or someone who just like came across it, cyclingfashionweek@gmail.com. You can send it anonymously, confidential. We won't share it with anything, because I'd love to see what one of these brand ambassador contracts look like.
You know how our good friends over at Cycling Tips have the Secret Pro, which is giving us kind of a peek into pro life in the peloton. One segment we could have here on Cycling Fashion Week is the secret brand ambassador. If there's a brand ambassador out there who wants to be the secret brand ambassador and wants to send us, glimpses of life as a brand ambassador, we would love to hear about it. And
the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah, we can obscure your voice and all that, or just read out what you send us.
Yeah,
much like the Secret Pro. But yeah, that's a great idea, Alex.
We're journalists, right? We have the anonymity of a source. Isn't that an important tenet of journalism? And we're journalists, sort of.
Okay, that's it for another episode of Cycling Fashion Week. Really enjoyed this interview with David Millar, who's very generous with his time. It's not every week that we have cycling legends on the podcast. So thank you very much to David Millar. Follow him on Instagram @MillarMind. Follow his brand CHPT3. Check out their stuff. They're a great brand out of Girona, out of the United Kingdom. So thank you again to David Millar for being a friend of the podcast. Thank you, Warren. Thank you, Tony. And thank you to our sponsors and our friends over at leclub.cc. Leclub.cc is your go-to destination for the world's most exciting cycling brands. They've got brands like MAP, Universal Colors, Fingers Crossed, Quack, Alba Optics. They've got Sweet Protection helmets as well. They do worldwide shipping, and they also offer excellent coffee that they will deliver to your door. Demand more from your cycling experience and go to leclub.cc. Follow us on Instagram @Cycling Fashion Week. Send us messages, send us emails, cyclingfashionweek@gmail.com. Send us your bikes to review. We haven't been doing it today because we had an interview, but we will get back to that in the next few weeks. Thank you very much to our listeners, and we will be back in a couple of weeks with another episode of Cycling Fashion Week. Take care.